It's with great pleasure tonight that I welcome our speaker, Professor Frank Frantauzzi, visiting us from the University of New York at Buffalo, where he serves as an associate professor of architecture. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Professor Gray from the Department of Architecture, and over the last week, my students have been doing a workshop at the Mud Studio in downtown Muncie, the studio that you saw in our first lecture, Tony Costello come and give a presentation of the history. We're actually working in the physical facility in the upstairs, doing a series of site-specific installations, and I think Frank will talk a bit more about that in his lecture. But what I would like to do is invite everybody to come down and join us after the talk for a reception that we're going to have in the studio. It's at 628 South Walnut. And if anybody would like to go but does not have a ride or does not know how to get there, I'll stay outside the doors here after the lecture, and you can come and find me, and I can, in all likelihood, pair you up with somebody that's going down there. And we're going to have pizza. Okay. Yeah. So. I've known of Professor Frantauzzi's work for many years, but have just recently met him, and it's been my great pleasure to have had the opportunity to work with him for a week now on this workshop and facilitate that. So I hope you all will join us for that. Frank has an undergraduate degree in architecture from Carleton University in Canada, Ottawa, and a master's degree from the Cranbrook Academy of Art. Central to his research and practice is an ongoing collaboration with James Cathcart and Terence Van Elslander. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And the collaborative calls themselves Iceberg Project. If anybody is interested in visiting a very interesting and provocative website, they can go to icebergproject.org. And see the work of the collaborative there. The collaborative has generated, the collaborative has generated over 20 cross-disciplinary site-specific installations in this country, Canada, and parts of Europe. And the work is generally seen more as a type of research rather than as art or architecture, although I think the work has a foot planted firmly in both of those worlds. It's informed by political, economic, and material concerns, and we'll hear more about that in Frank's talk. The work has been widely published in leading periodicals, including Art Forum, The Village Voice, the Pratt Journal of Architecture, and the Chicago Tribune. Recently, issue of the very prestigious architectural periodical Pamphlet Architecture number 25, was dedicated to the work of the collaborative. The work has also been exhibited domestically and abroad at venues such as the Storefront for Art and Architecture in New York, the Cap Street Gallery in San Francisco, and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Cincinnati. I hope you'll all help me welcome with enthusiasm Professor Frantauzzi.
Thank you, Tim. Is this, can everybody hear me? Is the microphone working? Higher? Actually, maybe you could help me with this. We can get it closer. How's that? Is that better? Okay, I'll try to raise my voice a little bit. Thank you for coming to the lecture, and I also want to start off by thanking Tim Gray and the college for the invitation to come and take part in the workshop. And lastly, I want to thank the students. They've been a pleasure to work with, and I think have been good ambassadors for the school. What I want to do tonight is show you a broad cross-section of projects, both projects that I've done on my own in collaboration with others and some teaching. Tim asked me before I came to try to address a little bit why I think it's important for students to have hands-on experience, why empirical education can be important for architects. And I'm going to try to do that in the lecture. I'm going to emphasize that. I generally don't show a lot of student work, but as I said, in this case, I'll show enough to give you a sense of how it's linked to my own research and creative work. I often, I'm going to start off actually with the slides here. Thanks. Can we dim the lights a bit? I often tell my students that architects don't build buildings, especially my freshmen. And I then go on to explain that architects make drawings and models from which buildings are built, that in fact contractors, carpenters, bricklayers make the buildings. And that gap between the conception of a building and the execution of a building, I think is an incredibly important one to bridge in order to be an effective architect. And it seems to me that unless one has some direct understanding of materials or properties, et cetera, that they're not going to be as effective an architect as they can be. And I would also say that that condition is being exacerbated, if you will, by increasing use of technologies, that it's getting easier and easier to make a building without, in a sense, feeling its contours and understanding it in a more direct way. I also want to state from the beginning that I think the work that's done in academia, as well as alternative contexts, is as important as work done in practice. That I tell my students often that the work that we do in school should not be seen as preparation solely for practice. That, in fact, there's an opportunity to do a type of work in these conditions that cannot be done in practice. And that together then we can span a much wider range of explorations. I've started with these two slides as a way to emphasize, again, that I'm going to be teaching about my own work and my teaching work. And what I'd like to just point out in this one example on the left, on your left, is this is an early project done by, I believe, a second-year student. And it was when I was just beginning to teach. And I remember asking the students to come up with sites, to invent their own sites, and then eventually to respond to those sites architecturally. The student in this case decided to make these large sort of shards of rock by laminating 2x4s together and then carving them by hand. And I still remember this to this day, the student spending weeks carving these shards of rocks and never getting to, or seemingly never getting to the building. Long story short, the student ended up making the building directly without any representations, without any drawings, in a matter of days after making the rocks, shaping the rocks over a space of a couple weeks. The way that I understand the significance of that is that the student understood the site intimately, and when it came to the response to the site, it was second nature, it was immediate, and the site was not foreign to the student. In the same spirit, the project on the right is a short study that I did in a warehouse with Michael Williams, an ex-graduate from Ball State, actually, where we were exploring the semantics of architecture, and in this case, decided to cross the role of a threshold with a function of storage, so that when the threshold collects all of the debris inside the room, it changes its reading and its semantic function, if you will. What I'd like to do is take a few moments and describe some tendencies that have surfaced in the work that I do collaboratively, largely with James and Terrence, as Tim mentioned. There are four tendencies that I've noticed over the years that have become central to the work. One is that the work is not projective. Secondly, that the work is based on strong oppositions or dialectics. Thirdly, that the work explores architecture as an index of other forces. And lastly, and this one again I'm adding in, given the context of this talk, that the work is didactic, that it's essentially educational. So to begin with, the work is not projective, and I'm just going to read this just to keep it to the point. In these projects, there is a direct relationship established with material, process, and site. The work is not representational. It is immediate, empirical, and executed at the scale of building. There's a phenomenological bias to the projects, whereby a reciprocal relationship is established between the author and the work. The work is not concerned with advancing the discipline or form of architecture. It does not defer to an ideal imperative for architecture. It is not interested in utopias. Secondly, as I mentioned, the work is often based on strong dialectics or oppositions, and I think you'll see this quite clearly in the projects. Examples of these dialectics are building and unbuilding, inside and outside, solid and void, push and pull, vertical, horizontal, etc. As a natural outcome of our interest in dialectics, certain conditions like hinging, rotation, mirroring, doubling appear often in the work. Thirdly, as I mentioned, for us, the work is seen as a kind of research, as Tim was saying. We see architecture as an index. And the goal of the work is essentially to uncover the underpinnings of architecture in the built environment. And as Tim also said, the projects confront and index the cultural, political, economic, and material constituents of architecture. We think of architecture as being no different than any other object that society produces, except that it is a basic product of all societies and perhaps the most completely involved in their ideologies and economic structures. In a sense, architecture is an ideal mirror. And then lastly, and I won't say much about this because I think the examples will explain it better. The work that we do is often didactic, it's educational. It's intended to inform people that are not trained as architects. And often that's done in empirical, direct methods. And again, I think you'll see examples of that. In fact, I'd like to start with this project here. This is an important project because it began our relationship and collaboration. It's a project called 9119 St. Cyril. It was done in 1989, shortly after I graduated from Cranbrook. And in this project here, we wanted to explore other dimensions of the single-family house, which often is thought of as the American dream, or the sort of the ideal of the American dream. What we did here was we bought a house from the city of Detroit for $1. Detroit is desperate to deal with its abandoned buildings for liability reasons, and they were more than happy to give us a building for $1. Our goal, or our task, was to take the building apart by hand and then move it to a gallery space where we were going to have an exhibition. And you can see on one side the house, the original house, and on the other side the installation of the house. When we went about installing the house in the gallery, our goal was to avoid any formal or formalistic gestures. And what we did instead was to essentially generate a kind of taxonomy of the house where we organized the house according to material. The only sort of exception, if you will, are these barrels, which actually hold the plaster from the house because of its the nature of the plaster itself. And here, what we were trying to do was to position the single-family American house somewhere between myth and economics. That clearly, when companies like General Motors grow or shrink, it causes tremendous havoc in terms of people's lives. And this building was chock full of history from the people that lived there, letters and other personal belongings. And again, because of a loss of someone's job, all of that quickly falls apart. And then again, by putting it inside the gallery this way, it forces people to confront buildings, and in this case a house, in very different terms, in a kind of unvarnished, direct terms, if you will. One grim statistic of this project is that when the project was complete, the entire house, the dismantled house, fit into one 35 cubic yard dumpster. And again, to think about the American dream and equate it to that unit of discard or debris is a shocking thing. There are many projects that I think are important to the beginning of our collaboration, and I'm only going to show you a couple. This is one. It's called Still, and it was done at Cranbrook Academy of Art. We were invited back to use their gallery space and to do an installation. The goal here was to affect the gallery space without introducing any foreign materials, to work directly with the gallery space. And after poking around, we discovered that the space, which, by the way, I should mention that the building is a Eliel Saarinen building. But it turned out that there was a false ceiling inside this particular space. So the project that we did was an attempt essentially to do something using a kind of economy of means and also an economy of expression. We wanted to make a kind of silent project, if you will, and that's partly the reason it was called Still. What we did here was we cut a rectangle in the ceiling on 3 sides and dimensioned it such that when it's in its drop state, it forms a wall inside the space. So we were able to divide the gallery in half simply by displacing part of the ceiling. There are other aspects to this that are interesting for architects. For example, the ceiling was constructed with a metal purlin system and mesh that was then impregnated with plaster. And it turned out that the mesh itself acted as a hinge. So there was elements of the construction that could be redeployed and used in an alternative way. After a couple of years of teaching, I was invited to take part in a teachers' conference, again, at Cranbrook Academy of Art. And the theme of the conference was alternative approaches to design studio. We were given the task, 8 studios were given the task to design a future studio building in a parking lot adjacent to the Cranbrook Academy of Art Museum. And you can see the parking lot on the left-hand side. For my particular contribution, I decided to avoid projection. I decided to avoid drawing and modeling, and instead to begin to actually construct the building directly on site. Because of the context, because of the site, which is a parking lot, the project ended up involving the following. We excavated a single parking space 8 feet down, as you can see in the photograph. We then lowered a full-size van into the cavity that was excavated, and then poured concrete around and underneath the van. It was propped up so the concrete would flow underneath. All of this was done prior to the conference. When the conference began, I took the individual faculty that were assigned to my studio to the site, which you can see on the left-hand side, and suggested that we would spend the next 3 days of the conference dismantling the truck and pulling it out, thereby revealing the cast. So what I'm interested in here is process. That the argument is that in this case, process is more important than product, and that process itself is an architectural idea, that rather than projecting architectural forms, building forms, that what I'm suggesting here is a process that can be played out in many different ways. There's all kinds of containers and other discarded objects of various sizes that could actually be building units if approached in that way. And you can see on the right-hand side one image of the final cast. Interestingly enough, when the project was done, it turned out that it was too expensive to remove the concrete. There was so much concrete poured that they would need dynamite to get rid of it. So the decision was made to backfill it and to blacktop the parking lot, which we did. But something very interesting happened, and that is that we all forgot which parking space was over top of the cast. And a couple of years later, the actual project was designed and built by Rafael Moneo. So I remember getting this phone call from the president of Cranbrook asking me if I could locate the cast because the construction people had to know where it was before they could start digging, and we couldn't find it. They did all kinds of test holes, and to this day we still don't know where it is. I'm pretty sure if you know the Moneo building that there's a courtyard, and I'm pretty sure it's underneath there. But nonetheless, there's something interesting to me about this project, which is now invisible, and it's more a set of stories and a set of myths almost than an actual object. So here we have essentially kind of architectural or art object that is, as I said, present in its absence as it sort of floats underneath this parking lot. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this project because it gets a little involved, but the reason I'm showing this project is that when I began teaching, the first thing I wanted for my students was to have the kinds of immediate empirical hands-on experiences that I'd had through the projects that I was doing. And this studio here, which was done at the University of Cincinnati, is called 8th Street Studio. And in my mind, to this day, represents probably one of the most idyllic teaching situations, architectural situations that I could imagine. We were given these 2 buildings by the city. They were slated for demolition so we could act on them freely. And the students, which happened to be a very good group of students, very committed group of students, took to this like fish to water. They instantly moved into the building rather than treating it as a place that they would go to. They actually lived there. So I think what happened here was that the site and the studio, the place of conception, if you will, became the same thing. The students also made a kitchen. They also built a shop. They also built a dark room. They also prepared a space for projection so that we could have seminars there. So their lives and their work became one, and the results for me are still haunting because of the kind of, as I say, the sheer kind of commitment that these students were showing for the project. And as I said, it's a bit involved to try to describe the individual projects, but maybe what I can do is just show you one as an example. This one here I think is maybe a good example. A lot of the projects that students were doing were empirical in nature again, and they were testing their understanding, their numeric understanding of architecture. So in this case, for example, a student rigged a system of counterweights that allowed the cutting of a series of joists. And it's a little hard to make out here, but if you look at the image on the left-hand side to the right, you're looking down through the first floor. All the joists have been cut, and then the floor that's been freed is cabled to the ceiling, which you can see slightly to the left of that image. And then that cabling goes back down into the basement. The basement is an earth basement, so the student then casts directly into the ground by excavating turnip-like forms, if you will, and then putting eyelets in and pouring it. So the student was guessing how much concrete would be required to deal with that compromised condition, and then was able to live with that for a number of weeks. And as it turned out, the student was very, very close. The floor deflected about ½ an inch. And again, this was an indispensable experience for the student because he came to understand the construction of a typical residential building in a much, much more intimate way. So those are the kinds of projects the students were doing. This is another interesting one, very simple to describe. Here the student was interested again in the invisible in the building, and what she did was she began with, on the 4th floor, she opened up a part of the ceiling and she hung a plumb bob from every rafter. Where the plumb bob touched the ground, she began to drill a hole. Or touch the floor, excuse me, she began to drill a hole. Occasionally, of course, she would hit another joist. Wherever she hit a joist, the plumb bob would stop. Wherever she missed a joist, the plumb bob would continue. She did this through 4 floors until she got to the basement, as you can see on the right-hand side, and therefore was able to determine the kind of spacing configuration of the joist throughout the building as if it was a huge filter. And again, these are studies in typical construction systems that, again, the students were able to learn from. And lastly, this project here was done in the basement. I mentioned it was an earth basement. And these students started digging and began making space, if you will, or volumes, just by digging this earth. Luckily, the earth was clay, so it was able to hold the form quite nicely. This brings me to another student project. This was a first-year project, and again, I think it shows, for me, the value of hands-on work. The students decided they wanted to build a sphere so that the sphere would hold individual projects that they would do later on, projects at a 1/4-inch scale. And they decided that the site, rather than being a typical rectangle, would be a sphere. And it sounded easy enough, and then they decided the sphere should be 7 feet in radius, so that the equator, the biggest point, would be taller than a person. And I kept thinking the whole time that was going to be a very, very difficult task. And so the project, as you can see here, involved coming up with a structure on the inside made mostly of 2x4 materials, you can see on the left, and then eventually a ribbing system of 3/4-inch plywood that was attached to the outside. The reason I'm showing you this project is because it's the kind of project that essentially taught itself and tested itself. That it became clear to me as the students were building it that what they were really after, even though they couldn't articulate it, was the balance between structure and weight. The more material they put into it to make it strong, the heavier the sphere got. And of course, the sphere had to be equally strong on every single point of its surface, a pretty ambitious task. And the students pulled it off. And it was a remarkable thing for them to deal with these problems as they came up. For example, they realized it was easiest to build the sphere in 2 halves because you had a flat bottom. But once built, they realized that they could not just lift one up and put it on top of the other one because of the weight. So they had to come up with a fairly ingenious system of leaning 1/2 up against a wall and then bringing the other half to it. And they figured out a kind of bolting system through the middle, through the equator essentially to put it together. And again, I think this was an important project because they were first-year students. And I think it gave them tremendous confidence in, that they could solve these kinds of problems and build at this full scale. And these are just some final images. The project was designed such that the openings at the very center, which are the largest ones, were large enough for someone to get inside, so the students could actually work both from the top and the bottom of their projects, which is interesting. That would be the equivalent of getting underneath the ground to work on the basement of a building. These are just the beginnings of some of the projects, and again, my argument would be that because they had built the sphere themselves, that they had a kind of understanding of it that allowed them to proceed with confidence. You can see two projects here. One of the interesting things about these projects is that they could not come above the surface of the sphere, otherwise they would get crushed. So all of them had to be recessed, and as you can see on the right-hand side, and actually on the left as well, that the ribbing itself had to act as a kind of structure, so it impacted the architectural ideas considerably. This is one more studio that I'll show, and then I'll show a little bit of student work later on. This was actually part of a visiting studio at the University of Minnesota. And what I wanted to do here was to come up with a studio that would be self-reflexive. That it's my contention that architecture is always site-specific, and that, more to the point, it's situation-specific. That the best we can do for our students is to prepare them to deal with complex situations that have lots and lots of layers. And what I wanted to do here was to actually make the situation of being a student part of the project. So the project was called Schoolwork, and it began when I found these wonderful school desks being thrown away and was able to get them for $1 a piece. I gave each student one of these school desks and then asked them to design a school of architecture and to cite it in the body of the desk. These desks have a flip top and they have a kind of volume underneath that for many of the students acted as a kind of as a chunk of ground that they could work in. Excuse me. The idea here was that once the projects would be complete, that all the desks would then form a single classroom. Excuse me. So what I'm doing here purposely is layering on top of one another a series of situation-specific conditions. The fact that they were architecture students designing a school of architecture, the fact that they were in a class and making a class with these desks, and lastly, and maybe most interestingly, is that it also conditioned how these projects were viewed. That the idea here was that a person would actually sit in the desk in order to read the work, rather than standing in front of a wall or in front of a base with a model on top of it. So at every turn, the hope was that one would be reminded of the actual conditions of the work. And you can see here the initial school desk, some of the work in progress, and then these are some of the solutions. And again, I won't get into all the subtleties, but every one of the projects was quite interesting in its own way. For example, this one had to, the student realized that because they were children's desks that they were too small. So he went through great pains to open it up so that a grown-up could sit at it. These are some other projects. Most of them operated in one way or another, and they used some interesting. They had some interesting use for the tabletop itself, as you can see in the slide on the right-hand side. The one on the left is interesting. What the student did here was they inserted a series of quarter-inch sheets of glass where they sandblasted sections of the human body, which would be the sections of the student. The idea was that, in this case, that the reader or the viewer would actually stand behind the chair, much like a teacher would look over your shoulder. And in that position, the sandblasted sections actually come back together again, and you have a kind of almost holographic sense of the students sitting there again, even though they're absent. Okay, so I'm going to get back now to some of the collaborative work, but I wanted to show those projects because, again, I think that as time goes on, I'm beginning to realize more and more that my teaching and my own work have always influenced one another, and it's been an interesting it's been an interesting trip because for a long time I desperately wanted to keep the work separate. I thought it was really important. But as I said, I think in the long run, the two are beginning to kind of spill into one another, hopefully for, in good ways. This project is called Arch. It was done in 2002, just outside of Buffalo. And the project is an experimentation in concrete. We did a series of experiments, you can see on the left-hand side, where we took bags of Quikrete and allowed them to cure by leaving them in the rain. As a kind of formwork, so that the actual paper itself was a formwork. And we started thinking about the bags of Quikrete as units, not unlike bricks. One of the convenient things about these so-called bricks is that they're soft initially. So when you first stack them, they sort of sit into one another. They kind of bend and really fit into one another, and then eventually they harden. So in some ways, it's almost, if you will, a kind of improvement on the basic brick in terms of the ability for these things to become stable. We managed to convince Quikrete Corporation to give us some 800 bags of Quikrete, as you can see on the right-hand side. All of this, by the way, was being done at a sculpture park, and that was significant to me because almost all the work we'd done up until then was indoor work. And the thought of actually doing something outdoor, I think, really had a big impact on the project. Also, working in nature, I think, was very different than working in museums and schools of architecture because of the kind of sense of time or the scale of time, if you will, in nature as opposed to the city. So the project, I think, was influenced by those initial observations. We also wanted to make it site-specific, I should say. The project, as you can see in these two slides, involved collecting dead trees from the nearby forest and making a large stack, as you can see on the left-hand side. The stack, by the time it was done, was about 9 feet tall or so. We then layered the Quikrete bags on top in the same fashion as you would an arch, in the same sort of careful fashion, thinking about how one bag pushes into the next bag, et cetera. And the project then was left to cure. The idea here is that the project would actually take many years to complete. It might take 10, 15 years to complete because the top ones would get wet instantly and become hard, and then slowly the bottom ones would also cure. At the same time as the bags are curing, the deadfall, the dead trees, are beginning to rot. So they're also starting to settle. So the idea here is that there's this kind of reciprocal relationship where by the time the trees disappear, the arch would be structural and offer an inhabitable space. This project was done now 4 years ago, and the project has come a long way. The image on the right-hand side was taken only about a year afterwards, and it was a remarkable transformation. If I had the slides, I'd show you that it went from these very bright commercial yellow bags to bleached white, and then eventually all the paper disappeared, and now you can actually see the hardened concrete. And the logs have dropped. You can actually see light through it. Also, the person who runs the sculpture park drove a truck over it, so we know it's stable. I guess he was just anxious. I kept saying this is like a 15-year project. I think after 2 years, he was ready to test it. Again, I'm showing you a quick student project because I want to show the potential linkages between the kind of work that I'm interested in doing and my teaching. At the same sculpture park, I became very good friends with the director. I was thinking about a freshman studio project. I wanted to give my students a project that would really teach them about logistics and how important logistics are in effective construction. The project that we came up with was to have each student make an intervention in a tree stump. There was an area of the park that had been cleared years ago, so there were dozens of tree stumps still there. And the students went about casting various architectural elements into the tree stump. The idea was that the students needed to anticipate the eventual disappearance of the stump so that the architecture becomes more and more visible as the stump disappears. And you can see some of the examples here. I didn't do it on purpose, but I think this project for me was also a way of marking the beginning of their education. This was then their architectural education. This was done at the end of their first semester. And I thought that it would be a wonderful thing for these students to be able to return to the park periodically to see how their project was doing. In fact, after 6 years of architecture school, these projects would be totally transformed, presumably like the students would be totally transformed. So these are just some images of the project. I should also mention the project was done in the middle of winter, in Buffalo winter. And that's something I did not anticipate. When the students got down there, there was like 5 or 6 feet of snow. So their ideas, they had these ideas of bringing 20 or 30 bags of Quikrete or concrete to the site, and then they quickly realized that there was no way to do it except by hand. And the project just became much, much more minimal because of just the resistance of the site. On the right-hand side here, you see a very subtle project where a student has made a cavity in the stump and then cast a bronze covering that was made by grafting the texture of the bark in the first place and then making a mold for it. The one on the left is interesting because the students, as I mentioned, this was in the middle of winter, started working on this stump, and then as the weather got better and better, they realized it wasn't a stump at all. It wasn't actually a stump. It was just a big old log that was stuck in the snow. And they had to deal with it, and they came up with this clever solution here where those 2 rods actually go into a concrete pad that's underneath the ground as a way to make the stump part of the ground again. This is another project that I did with students. This is an interesting situation because this was not for credit. This is at Ohio State, and I was invited to take part in an exhibition in Chicago dealing with automobiles, in part because of the truck project that I've already shown you. And a group of ex-students of mine and I came up with a simple idea of making a car spin in a circle as opposed to going forward and backwards. And there's a whole discussion here about capitalism, about this kind of reduced mentality of forward and backwards and nothing in between. So the project became very simple, and that was to reprogram the vehicle and to reconfigure the drivetrain so that the car could either drive normally or it could actually spin in a circle. And these images here, the one on the left in particular, show the car spinning. And on the right, you can see a very dizzy student coming out of the car. An interesting result of this project that I hadn't anticipated is that it became another programmatic idea came up, which was that this vehicle was like a branding machine, that you could go anywhere in the city and it would leave these beautiful, after using it, it would leave these beautiful concentric circles, like a kind of branding or tagging, if you will. And the car was able to do this from site to site. This is the project that we did at the Storefront for Art and Architecture, and it was an important project for us because of the visibility of the project. And it was also important because I think we really wanted here to test the limits of the gallery, to really ask ourselves, what is a gallery? What is its purpose? How does it serve society? What we did for this project was we essentially gave the space of the gallery over to the public. This is in the Lower East Side, where there's a tremendous amount of homeless people. And we had discussions about the fact that if you don't have money in New York, it's terribly denigrating that you can't go to a bathroom, for example. You can't just walk into a McDonald's and use their bathroom without actually buying something first. So on a regular basis, people are reduced in terms of having to use other methods to go to the bathroom. So what we did here was we inserted 5 portable toilets through the facade of the Storefront for Art and Architecture and made them available to the public for the 5 weeks of the exhibition. And there's, again, multiple things going on. One was that the institution was called the Storefront, but in fact, and you can see why, by the way, on the left-hand side, that the space is actually quite small and thin, but it's all based on this kind of old storefront. So we wanted to deal with the storefront itself. We also wanted to essentially kind of erase the distinction between inside and outside, and this is, as I said, the project that we came up with. When we did this project, when we proposed it, a lot of things came to the surface, and it was gratifying because it's why we came up with the project in the first place. What we found in proposing the project that we began to bump up against invisible realities of the gallery that we wouldn't have known about in advance. For example, the gallery owners were very, very concerned about liability. Their lawyers were very concerned about this because apparently if they were to find a dead body in one of these portable toilets, they would be responsible because it would be in their space. So all of a sudden, liability becomes a criteria in the work that you do in the gallery. Another aspect was that the gallery owners initially were really offended by the proposal. They thought that we were suggesting that people would, pardon the language, shit in their gallery, which we were, of course. But again, there's a whole precedent for this, beginning with Marcel Duchamp and his urinal, where high art and low culture collide. So that was an intentional thing. Anyway, when we first proposed this, the people that ran the gallery looked to us and said, we hope you have another idea. There's no way you're going to do this. And this was days before the opening, I have to tell you. So we decided to go out and relax, have a beer, and talk about the project. And about a few hours later, we got a phone call from the owners. And something had happened, I don't know what, but they made a 180-degree turn and told us that they were very excited about this. They would pay for the rental of the portable toilets, and we proceeded. And I think what happened, and I don't hold this against the gallery, I think it's understandable, is that they saw that in fact this would be a highly politically correct project to do. Gallery gives over space to the homeless. How could that not be a winner? So that the project did get built, and as you can see here, the inside and the outside as it's finally shown. People sometimes ask if the toilets were used. The answer is absolutely. In fact, after we put in the first one, down the street came a man with a child, and the child desperately had to go to the bathroom. So he was very, very happy to have this first bathroom in there, and the little boy was the first one to use it. By the way, it also made for a very bizarre opening. And New York openings are just packed with lots and lots of people, and we put newspapers inside the toilet so you'd have something to read when you went, et cetera. But it was a very, again, a very challenging way to think about art. This is a project that we did not too long ago at the University of Buffalo, where I teach. I was asked to do a project in our gallery there, and I invited James and Terrence to take part. The project is called Slice, and what it does is it opens up a slot of space that connects two spaces that used to be continuous. Essentially, it's a historic project. It's a way of actually revealing the history of the building. The building is a classical building, and you can see here the process where we cut a 35-foot long by 5-foot high slot, built in a hinge system, and also what we did was we used the drywall itself as a kind of membrane so that the wall would not fail, and then we're able to just spin it around into its final position. And the image on the right, I think, is particularly clear in terms of what we were after. You can see the exhibition space in the front and the other space in the back. The two spaces had been estranged for many, many years, even though they had all the same architectural details. One was kept up, the other one was not. And it was like bringing back together two siblings that had been separated for a long time. Interestingly, you could also see here that not only was a wall built between the two spaces, but eventually a floor was built in one of the spaces and turned into two different levels, as you can see, as I say, on the right-hand image. And lastly, as I mentioned, it's a classical building, and it turns out that our project is at the exact center of the building, so that it becomes a kind of diagram or partie of the organization of the building itself. This is a project I don't show often, in part because I'm still trying to get my head around it, but it's an interesting one again in terms of teaching and doing one's own work. I received a grant from the University of Buffalo to explore public art, and worked with a whole host of architecture students to essentially make a book, a bronze book of all of the important maps and buildings in the city. The book is operable. Each page is about 350 pounds heavy, and that explains the counterweights that you see to the left. And the idea here, again, was to explore public art. The argument was that much public art is alienating to the layperson, that unless you have an art history background, et cetera, that it's difficult to understand the work. So the book as a vehicle, the idea of the book as a vehicle was that it would be very accessible. Everybody knows how a book operates. Books also, as we all know, have a certain degree of legitimacy, a certain degree of, they project truth, they speak a truth, et cetera. So there was a whole series of ideas, cultural ideas that we were playing with here. But we set about actually casting in bronze some 50 separate buildings, as you can see here, and welding them together. And along the bottom are also a series of casts that textually describe the entire history of the city, all of its main events. And this is now located in Buffalo. So it's essentially a gift back to the city, and a way for the people to kind of, for the layperson, to kind of have a sense of its own city. In fact, I remember asking the question, how do we develop an identity, a civic identity in a city? And I think that that was largely the role of this, was to try to make it a common discussion by making this large book, the biggest book in the city, the book that will last the longest. It's made out of bronze, which is associated with monuments. There's a whole series of connections here that we were trying to draw. It took 4 years, by the way. I thought it was going to be like a 6-month project. It took 4 years. This takes me to a project that I did in collaboration with Murdad Hadigi, who's now my chair at University of Buffalo. And it was, again, an opportunity to involve many students who really wanted to do this kind of hands-on work. The project is called Big Orbit, and it's really driven by the site. The gallery itself is called Big Orbit, and it turns out the gallery is square in plan. And it also turns out that right next to the gallery is a courtyard, which is identical in size and configuration to the gallery space itself. So we very quickly decided to do a kind of 2-part project that would deal with inside and outside, and that's where it began. Also, I should mention that the building used to be an old ice house, and wooden pallets were obviously a common part of that landscape. So we decided to use industrial pallets as a material. There was also an interest in this project to think about making architecture by carving, starting with a solid and actually carving space directly out, which is a very different way than we often conceive of buildings. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to show on the left-hand side the inside component of the project, and on the right-hand side you can see the outside courtyard piece of the project. The project involved carving an elliptical solid in the courtyard on the right and an elliptical void in the space on the left. On the left, what you'll see is that we begin with a large cube of pallets, and on the inside we carve out this 3-dimensional ellipse. And on the outside, as I said, it's a very different process. You get the solid. The two are exactly the same size, so the solid on the outside conceptually fits into the negative on the inside. Excuse me. There was another secondary interest here which continues to interest me, and that is the relationship between drawing and making. I've always thought that drawing is a lot like cutting a line, that a pencil and a circular saw or a reciprocal saw in some ways are very, very similar, that when you draw a line on paper, that it often equates to a cut line in reality. And it was really fascinating for us to discover actually how to go about making these. Even as, as professors of architecture, we didn't fully anticipate how the two would actually be made. And I think you might find it interesting. On the right-hand side, with a solid, it turns out, as all of you know, ellipses have 2 centers. And the way you make an ellipse is you take those 2 centers, you take a loose cable, and if you pull on the loose end of the cable, you get an ellipse every time. That's the definition, actually, of an ellipse. Turns out for the solid, that because of the reality of making, that we had to cut every layer separately. So we mathematically calculated the centers in advance. There's a metal wire you can see sort of to the top of the right-hand image that we hung in advance, and then hung plumb bobs that were movable so that we could reposition the centers every single time, and then use a very large cable to empirically draw it and then cut it. And even the cutting process turned out to be an incredible process, and I, again, never thought about this. Because of all the nails, you can't simply take a circular saw to a pallet. You're going to get into all kinds of trouble. So it, in fact, required that we cycle through a series of tools, beginning with a jigsaw, then a reciprocal saw, and then finally a circular saw to get it really smooth. We found a circular saw, by the way, that held a 12-inch blade. I'd never seen something that big. And that's how it was made. On the inside, on the other hand, we found that it was actually much, much easier. On the inside, you can see that in front of that person standing there, that there's a metal tripod. Turns out that if you have a metal tripod at the 2 ends of what is actually called an ellipsoid, a 3-dimensional ellipse, that if that cable has any slack in it, if you push on the cable at any point and in any direction, you're in fact describing the ellipsoid in negative. So the one on the left, you were able to attach tools directly to the cable and carve directly into the pallet. So we could stack the pallets and then with a tool actually cut directly into it. And then it never had to be repositioned. The entire setup just required that one cable. And again, something that we had not, it's ironic that you would learn about representation as you're making something, that after the conception is when you learn about drawing and representation. And these are just some final photographs of the finished piece. I still remember chuckling when one of the visitors to the gallery asked if we had actually taken the solid and pulled it out of the other part, which would be physically impossible, of course. But again, I think that's, that says a lot about how the layperson looks at this. I mentioned earlier that I'm beginning to realize that a lot of the work is didactic, and this one is very much that way. What happens here is that we organize the two pieces so that the viewer would first walk in through the negative, so they would experience a space. Then they would walk through a door to the courtyard, and then they would see as a solid the very space that they were in. So they saw the space as a figure, as a solid, which is something that we do all the time in our heads when we're designing architecture. But again, I'm not sure that most people can do that. So that was also one of the intentions behind the project. Okay, we've only got a few more projects to go here. I think we're doing pretty good for time. This is a project called Push-Pull, and it's the first time that I experimented with latex. And again, here's another example where the project explored only a limited number of ways to use the latex, and the workshop down at MUDS is actually an opportunity to extend some of that thinking. And in fact, I learned as much from some of the projects as I'm sure the students did. But it all began with this simple project here. Once again, we wanted to do a project that did not bring in a lot of objects into the space. We had two rooms to work with. It was a concrete building. And what we did was we painted both floors from wall to wall continuously. And in the process of painting it, I should mention latex comes in a liquid medium and you roll it on or paint it on, and it builds up with coats to a point where it becomes very, very strong and can be then deformed in various ways. What we did was we ended up painting probably about 16 or 17 coats in total. About halfway up, about 8 coats into the project. On the left-hand side, we dropped in a piece of polyethylene plastic. As the rectangle, you can see that's a little more yellow. And at the 4 corners, we painted in bicycle inflation valves that were just cut out of inner tubes. And then on the right-hand side, we put a 20-foot long steel bar, rectangular bar, and then put the plastic on top of that, and then kept painting. And I should mention there are 2 large eyelets in the metal bar. We did this knowing in advance that we would inflate one of the spaces, which is on the left-hand side, just by using a compressor and pumping air into it. And then on the right-hand side, we attached cables and come-alongs to the metal bar, and we ratcheted up that form to become this kind of teepee form, as you can see in the image. And that was the project. That was the final project. It's called push-pull because in the first case, the air is actually pushing the form into that, to that kind of dome shape, or the material to that dome shape. And in the other case, we're actually pulling the bar and stretching the material into that sort of teepee shape that you can see. And that's how the title came up. The piece with the bar was very hard to pull off because of the suction. We realized at one point that air had to somehow get underneath in order for us to pull this thing. So that was incredibly hard to do, but we pulled it off. And because of it, we had another name for the project, which we decided not to use for political reasons, which was suck and blow. One being blown and one being sort of sucked up. But again, we decided to avoid that discussion. When the project was over, we had an opportunity to cut the pull piece, the stretched teepee piece, and we're able to get inside of it. And it was actually kind of a striking thing. You'll see this if you come down to MUDS tonight. Latex has an amazing ability to pick up all kinds of information. So in essence, we were actually taking all of the traces of past installations from the floor, and it became this kind of skin that you could see through from the inside. Speaking of MUDS, we do have a couple of photographs of the work down there. And these are beautiful photographs, I have to say. They're thanks to Tim, who definitely knows his way around a computer and got some very beautiful photographs here. On the left-hand side is the space before the project was done. And on the right-hand side is one of the pieces that was done there. This is a staircase that does not have a rail around it. And I understand that one of the requirements for doing the workshop was that we would make it safe so that visitors wouldn't fall into the opening. And this very simple project was done where latex was painted around the opening, as you could see, on the two sides. And then once cured, it was then stretched into place as a rail, as you could see it in these two images over here. And once again, you can see it a little bit in this photograph. All the floorboards, all the texture, the colors of the site were actually embedded inside the latex. I have to say that the real thing is even better than these photographs. The detail is really quite amazing. It looks like wood grain, basically, in the latex. And also, again, there's, I think, tremendous amounts to be learned by working together. On the left-hand side, this is like a barn raising. There's that wonderful moment where everybody pitches in and makes something happen, which, again, I think is an important thing for architects to have a feeling for. As you can see here on the left-hand side, some of the information that the latex picked up, it's really remarkable, the kind of life that the material has. This is one of the student projects, very, very beautiful project. It began with a square, as you could see in the left-hand image at the bottom. And the student began the project by focusing on a metal pipe that was in the space. It just kind of stuck out of the ground, and conceived of this square of material that would be raised along this pipe and then stop at the top and then get deformed in any number of directions using tension elements tied from the floor to the ceiling. And on the right-hand side, you can see its final position. What I really like about a project like this, I have to say, is that it's almost like a form-making machine. That you could, by changing the cabling, you can keep experimenting, come up with multiple variations. Okay, this is a project that I did last spring, and it's still fresh in my mind, but I wanted to show it to you because I think it once again emphasizes the importance of process in my work. This is a permanent piece at Lehigh University. It's outdoors. And that in itself is, I think, pretty important because much of the early work that we did only exists in photographs. So having the opportunity to make permanent work, as you can understand, for an architect especially, is pretty important. For this project, the people helping me and I decided that we would work with steel because Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, as you know, is the birthplace of Bethlehem steel. And the city is actually still dealing with a loss because Bethlehem left and the city has really had to kind of rechart its direction. We wanted to do a project that would, using direct forces, deform a bunch of rebar, and then by welding the rebar, that form would be held. So the project involves building two long rails that are drilled and that eventually are brought together. You can see on the right-hand side, the two bars that I'm talking about are the continuous ones. The one at the back and the two little pieces at the front eventually come off. They were there just to stabilize the whole system. And once the rebar was placed in there, and I should mention the rebar was woven, that rather than just going from hole to hole, we would stagger them so that there was a kind of built-in weave to the rebar. Once that process was complete, you can see some other photographs here. On the right-hand side, you could see that there are these pneumatic jacks that are now pulling the front ends of those two long rails together, therefore forcing the rebar up into this position that you can see there. And this is the final project here, where the rebar has now been welded at all the intersections, which makes it totally rigid. So now you can actually climb on top of this, and it actually has structural capacity. The long rails are also welded permanently on top of those piers near the front. Feet by 10 feet. We figured out a system for making seams that would be airtight, and then we're able to inflate it. On the right-hand side is the beginning of the installation in the gallery. So we did a quick experiment so that we could be certain that the full-scale project would work, which was quite large. The project is called Body Bag. It's we calculated the volume of a typical body. and this gets a little gruesome, but we calculated the volume of a typical body and multiplied that by the number of dead in Iraq, which gave us exactly this volume, and that's what determined the final size of this. And obviously the point here was to make crystal clear, empirically clear, the amount of carnage that the war has drawn us into, that a number doesn't make a lot of impact, but when you actually see what it equates to in real space and time, I think it has a whole other effect. Ironically, this was done about a year ago, and at that point, the death toll was about 2,000. I haven't looked recently, but I'm sure we're well past 2,000. Interestingly, you keep inflating this, you actually make it bigger and bigger. But the project was in the gallery for about a month, and at this point, the body bag is being stored. So with that, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to the lecture, and I'll be very happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions? We hope to see you all at the reception at Mudd's. And I think we have time for a couple questions. We actually finished up in a pretty good time here.
This is not a comparison in this way, but you've been around a while. I was wondering what you thought of the work of site architects in the 70s and early 80s, late 60s. And the second question I had is, how do they clean those toilets?
How do they clean these?
Toilets. The toilets.
The toilets?
Yeah.
Okay. Two very different questions.
Service once a week. They've got a truck. I should have shown a photograph. They've got a truck with a hose that plugs in and everything is drawn out. So that, no, they don't have to move them, no. It's a system where they can just, I guess, suck out the material out of the portable toilet. So it's actually a very convenient, convenient thing. In terms of your other question, I think that my graduate education was significant. I studied at Cranbrook Academy of Art. And Cranbrook, if you know about it, you'll know that it's this amazing institution that really brings all the arts together. So for the first time as an architect, I was talking to sculptors and painters and printmakers and others. In fact, the reviews that we got were from people in those areas. So we would have, ceramicists look at our work, et cetera. And I think that was pretty significant. Since then, as a teacher, I've become very, very interested in the work of the conceptual artists, earth artists of the 70s, largely in this country, actually, and have initially just my own, just researched it because I was interested in it, and then eventually taught seminars in it. So there's an absolute link to it. I think that we have so much to learn from those people, the Robert Smithsons of the world, Dennis Oppenheim, Gordon Matta Clark, who was an architect and was essentially shunned by architects, but that's another discussion, and is now considered a sculptor, and you have to go to the art section to see his work. But so there are many, many people like that whose work I admire greatly because they said, number one, they break all the rules. I sometimes tell my students that art is an amazing discipline because there have been so many moments in art history where they essentially destroy art. Someone like Marcel Duchamp comes along and says, painting is dead. And in fact, art keeps going. So art has the ability, like a phoenix, to do the most radical anti-art thing, and then it becomes art. There's something beautiful about it, and I think architecture could learn from that. I think we tend to be a little bit more conservative, let's say, in terms of how we think of history and how we think of what we do. But absolutely, I love that work, and it's important to me. And if I may, just as a last observation, one of the things I think makes our work a little different, on the other hand, from installation work typically is that we're architects. That a lot of these projects could not have been done unless we had some understanding of structure, logistics, et cetera. Much like Matta Clark, you could not have done those cuttings without understanding the structure of the buildings. So I think the work is clearly architectural at that level as well.
I'm interested in one particular thing, I think, with the advent of CNC technology and what's going on digitally these days. What is your reaction to that? I can see that in your work there's sort of this periphery you make, and you even commented on this idea of drawing and making, which I think is interesting, and this idea of cutting and being subtractive, and that's a lot of what we deal with when we talk about this fabrication. So I just kind of wondered what is your position on that?
Sure. I think that's good.
And one actually that Tim mentioned that I might address in the lecture. Over the years, I've become known as a foundations instructor and sort of made my career on that. And I remember to this day, this one class of beginning design students, I asked these students to make some hand drawings of a building. And this one student actually drew it on AutoCAD first and then traced it afterwards on his desk. That he was more comfortable doing it on AutoCAD rather than making the measurements on paper initially. So my feeling is this, that I think as architects, we're responsible for the built environment. We're the last ones that can make the built environment, healthy and quality oriented. And I think we have to have an understanding of what that means. We have to understand the physical world in a way that, a lot of others don't. So I think that if we lose that connection, our work is just not going to be as 4 or 5 dimensional as it could be. It's going to be for the eye alone. I mean, this is, so absolutely, I think that the two have to go hand in hand. Dan Hoffman, who's one of my teachers at Cranbrook, put it well when he said that a computer does not know a brick. It cannot understand a brick. It doesn't know how heavy it is. So for me, that's the thing. At least for the time being, we still have to be the brains behind what's going together. We cannot let a machine do it for us. I also worry about the kind of laziness that technology can create in what we make. That I see students all the time now who, rather than cutting a piece of cardboard, will have it cut on a machine. But clearly, there are skills to be learned, cutting it yourself that are indispensable. So the way I feel about it is that, certainly with my teaching, that as freshmen, they do that. They work with their hands. They draw. They do it the old-fashioned way. They construct perspectives. They use an SRL camera so that they understand how, what the elements are before they start deploying it in these other ways. There's no question that. Actually, let me back up. One other anecdote. I think it was Peter Eisman that said, once people started using computers, that a new age had arrived, that with a computer, you only had to imagine it for it to be built. And that's not true. That's not true. You still have to build it. And this goes way back to what I was saying earlier about the gap between what we do on paper or on a screen and what those people are doing when it's raining and they're digging a hole and they're thinking about how strong the concrete's going to be. That's what we do, and I suspect for quite a long time that's still going to be the case. But I think, it's exciting what they can do. There's no question about it. And I think that those tools are going to be indispensable in the future. And already they're starting to show lots of, great results. But I don't think it can replace our bodily sense of architecture. I mean, there have been times when I've talked to students about how it's possible to learn through your hands, that you can actually short-circuit the brain, that doesn't have to go through there and then here, that you can learn, in a kind of haptic, direct way. And again, I think that that our technology is not there yet. So that's my feeling about it.
Indulge myself with one last question. You talked a bit about the reciprocity between your work and the teaching and the student work. And in the work that you showed, I can see a lot of very direct architectural lessons. The scale of the work, the methods and tools that are used to achieve the work are very architectural. It seems very much rooted in architectural conventions. And it's very easy for me to make that leap and to understand that correlation as a student might be working on a stack of pallets and sort of, to take one example, creating that shape and learning how to cut the pallets, etc. Are there other lessons in terms of the type of work that you showed that are, how do you see it as applicable in terms of developing a way to think about architecture that might inform how a student would practice architecture after school?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I don't want to end
the lecture or the talk off on a critical note, but the bottom line is that architecture has always served power. Architecture, whether we like it or not, serves other ends. And I think we have to take responsibility. I think there has to be an ethics to what we do. I think we have to decide what projects we do and don't want to work on. And I think that the lessons that come out of the work is, as I use the word very carefully, is that there are many, many things underpinning the work that we do, and we should not just be tools. That we have to, we were joking the other day over lunch about, bad architecture, and I was making the point that I made the proposal that just like in the old days, that there should be a stone at the entrance of every building with the architect's name on it. I think that's a really important thing because we are the people that are actually shaping our environment, for better or for worse. So I think that that's really, really important. It's not to be naive, to understand what is motivating the work that you do and how do you best, where do you stand? How do you make sense of it? How do you make a piece of work that you can be proud of and make some positive contribution, at some level? And I think that you can't be naive about it. So I think that part of it also is clear to my students. And the work that they do obviously doesn't engage the same level of political issues because they're still within the confines of the institution. But I think when they look at the work that I do with my collaborators, I know they're aware of that, and hopefully they carry some of that forth in their own practices. And as we were saying to our students today, Tim, as you well know, that one needs to invent practice for themselves. Every person in this room can decide how they want to practice. How do they decide what to do? And that's a really important thing to keep in mind so that our schools don't become trade schools. That I think architects have a tremendous amount to offer our society. I make points to my students about how some of the best filmmakers that we know of were actually trained as architects initially, or how students that I knew in graduate school went on to spend their time, dedicating their lives to doing things like recreating old instruments. There's somebody at Cranbrook that I know that does that now. Is one of the few people in the world that can very accurately recreate these kinds of instruments. He never set out to do that when he studied architecture, but he has the capacity because of the education. So I think it's a really great question, Tim. And I, as I said, I don't want to exaggerate it because I think students have to find it for themselves. But clearly there is that kind of ethical dimension to to what I'm asking them to do.
Excuse me. I understand you do much study of material. That's definitely clear in the presentation. And this question, I guess, is not entirely due to material, but maybe just as a precursor, like how architects should reconsider whether or not to use material. But there's been a lot of use of materials that are kind of smart, or use of materials that are characterized by material flows through them. For instance, the ice exhibits where the material is water, but it's only used for construction when the flow pulls and maybe green materials as well, similar scenario. But that brings up this kind of like interesting construction issue where most construction methods of the scale of building can be reduced to a scale that we understand. Like for instance, push-pull, I definitely can't do that with my own hands, but I can understand the concept by having blown up with a balloon. Or having built a building with structural steel, I can understand that by building a small model. But with these smart materials, there's construction methods that we haven't yet found ways of reproducing at a small scale. So when the architect uses them, it's somewhat impersonal. There's something that we almost have to just kind of trust the theory produced by other fields. So I guess my question is really, how do you respond to that as an architect? Like, because that becomes a distance, and I guess it relates back to Paul's question about fabrication, that you thought, or your response was that we need to be able to understand it, it needs to be tangible first, and then we have control. But with smart materials, do you think we do have control?
Well, I think we should kind of get into the material in order to really understand it. I think it would be a terrible thing if our only role was to snap together pre-made elements And I think that's that's not a very good type of architecture. So I think no matter how sophisticated materials get, we still have to work from the inside out. I think I could also make an argument at the same time that building is actually pretty it's pretty archaic. It's pretty basic. The concepts have not changed that much. So I don't think that the science of building is going to get to a point where where we're going to be helpless and not be able to kind of take things apart. I mean, there's been many architects who have done that. They've taken off-the-shelf, materials and systems and really done wonderful things with them. And so I think we have to, in a positive way, subvert continuously. It's actually, it's going back to digital technology. I remember when computers were first being introduced, people were first starting to use them, that the one thing that really drove me crazy was that somehow you had to get in someone else's head to figure out how to use it. In other words, someone had predetermined my moves, and it really worried me. I sort of felt like I was caught in this kind of game that had already been predetermined, pre-planned. Now, of course, it's not the case. I think, obviously, something like AutoCAD can draw anything in theory, right? But my point is that I think we should always be concerned about that. We should not, be dictated to. I think as architects we have a very high responsibility for rethinking things, including institutions. I mean, it's possible when a client comes to you that you can educate them and have them, develop their ideas and not take their first program and build it as they want it. So I think that when it comes to materials or program or the city or clients, that I think it's our job to constantly, get inside and ask bigger questions about, the things that we're doing, because we have a huge impact. I mean, I don't know the numbers. I'm sure there are people that are more concerned about sustainability, et cetera, that know these numbers. But I do know that the building trade in this country is the largest, sort of user of materials and the largest producer of waste, et cetera, et cetera. So we're not an inconsequential, component. So I go back to that question. I also, at another time, would love to have a discussion about what a smart material is. Because a lot of times we get these words that we start using and we're not entirely clear. I remember the first time someone told me, someone asked something about a workstation. I thought they meant like a workbench where you have your drill and your tools, and a workstation is actually this. So when did that happen, that a workstation means only this and not like a bench in a shop, So I think when we talk about smart materials, we've got to be much, much more, we got to define our terms, before we can really get into it. But
Thank you very much, Frank. I'd like to continue the conversation as much, so maybe we should head down there for the reception. If anybody needs